Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hi everybody, I'm sure you're going to love this episode with Stella. She's such an expert in the area of learning. And I thought it was worth just flagging that I am back doing training personally. Generally it's remote and I'm doing it custom for different customers. But if you would like to work with me in a consultancy form, or if you'd like to run some training in your business, then do get in touch because I am back on it in 2024. The sorts of subjects I'm running my Change Superhero course, which has just got amazing feedback from a government organisation recently, and I love doing it, I have to say. I'm also enjoying working with the higher education sector, all about managing underperformance. And of course, there's good old people management. So if those are topics that you would like to do some sort of hybrid training, customised to the needs of your organisation, and you'd like to work with me personally, do get in touch because I'm going to be running more of that in 2024. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And I'm really excited that I've got a special guest here today. This is somebody that I'd heard lots and lots about, but never had the opportunity to meet. So I'm really delighted that I've got Stella Collins here, who's the co-founder and chief learning officer of Stella Labs. She also does way more than that. She's a total expert in the topic that we're going to talk about, which is linking neuroscience and also linking into AI. But Stella, I think it's best if I hand to you just to give us a little bit of a feel for your background and how you end up in this space and your specialism.
Well, hello, Lucinda, and thank you so much for inviting me to join your podcast today. It's really nice to meet you too. So actually, I'm in kind of the perfect space now. I started as a psychologist. I was studying psychology at university, which I absolutely loved. And I was really interested in how the brain worked and kind of, all the things that went around that. But when I left university, there were no jobs around in that kind of thing. And there were lots of jobs in IT. So I went into IT and worked very happily for many years as a programmer, coder. But I kind of kept this interest in artificial intelligence because it was one of the things we studied at uni. And around the I suppose it was the early 90s now, actually, I got involved in expert systems, which were a way of a kind of an early form of work-based AI. So I got really involved in them. And then at some point in my career, I kind of transitioned. We went to New Zealand for a few years. And when I came back, I transitioned into learning out of IT and found that this was really where I kind of really flourished. I met some great people, had some fantastic experiences, set up a company, Stella Learning. And then one thing led to another. And I kind of did 25 years doing that. And then 4 years ago, we set up a company called Stella Labs here in Belgium. So with a Belgian entrepreneur. And now we're kind of bringing, kind of the science of learning, the neuroscience together with the AI and building a learning platform, which is just kind of, fusing all my life's experiences together.
It is interesting, isn't it? You're slightly ahead of your time then, I guess, in terms of being ready to do this. But now this is the right time for it, which is why I guess this topic is such an interesting one for us to have the benefit of your insight. So I mean, we're kind of talking about how you might mix AI and neuroscience, but I think let's go back to basics. And obviously, this is our audience are HR professionals, which includes learning and development professionals, but not all HR professionals are really confident in learning. And I think it's really helpful, particularly some of the ones that are in maybe smaller businesses and they're expected to know everything about everything vaguely HR. If we were going to talk about how people learn, and particularly in the workplace, what would you say?
So I think there's two obvious kind of basic categories. There's the formal learning that people take place in at work, and that's generally, through courses. They might be sent out to do courses, they might be doing courses internally. Unfortunately, courses aren't as effective as they should be, and there's a really kind of a lot of evidence that shows that a lot of people don't transfer what they learn in the courses into the workplace as kind of applicable skills, because what we're really looking for at work is that people can do their jobs better. That's also what people want. They want to improve their skills so they can get better jobs or move up in the organization, whatever it might be. But we kind of know that transfer of learning into work is typically only at around 20%, and that seems to be fairly static, sadly, unless you do something about it. And then the other way people learn at work is informally, which can be quite effective. We all learn to do different things at work, but there's no measure. It's very hard to see how effective that is. And the informal work tends to happen through, you have a need, you get curious about something, you try something out, you practice it, you maybe get some support from a colleague, and you kind of repeat it until you kind of think, oh yeah, I've got that. But again, that can also be improved with, support from relevant people, like mentoring or coaching, or even just, really good feedback from somebody that you value. More reflection really, really helps people, because, we often learn kind of quite unconsciously. When we're not learning formally, we learn unconsciously. And actually, if we could make that process a bit more conscious, then we could reflect more and actually learn from the bits that were useful and kind of discard the bits that were perhaps less useful. So I think there's those two main distinctions as to whether people are learning formally or informally at work.
I'd quite like to dig into some of those. I think there's quite a lot of interesting aspects there. I'm trying to think, but in terms of, I'm going to go with this one first in terms of, as we've progressed over the last sort of 20 years, so I'm thinking I was in a learning and development role 20 years ago in an organisation. It was quite typically training courses was the go-to, or that's sort of almost people's expectation was. You had things like e-learning, which was your classic e-learning, which people would kind of wade through, which wouldn't be that interactive. So that's how I kind of perceive it in big companies as was then, and that was people's expectation. I see things have progressed. I see things like COVID have had an impact. And I think the whole thing about reflection is something maybe we look at separately, as how we could, get more reflection to take place. But with all those my sense of things that have changed, what would you've obviously got a much better sense of how things have changed and what the research says about it.
So I think what's really changed most, and I think you're absolutely right, COVID had a massive effect. And I think the big change there is people have become much more accustomed to digital learning, whether that's e-learning or whether it's, we're having a Zoom call now, that's become much better. So I guess there's much more emphasis on blended learning now, that we blend digital with some face-to-face, with some coaching. That's really changed. I think what's also changed is, when I was first working with companies 20 years ago, they kind of had a catalogue that was set up for the year. It was mostly face-to-face or e-learning. It was kind of, they were either one or the other. They weren't.
And that's blended. Blended then wasn't really digital. It was kind of, you go and do it on your own in e-learning, or it wasn't interactive like we can now do with systems like this.
Absolutely not. And it was like, they had a course program for the whole year. So if you wanted to learn communication skills, you had to wait until September, because that's when the course was, regardless of whether you had the need now or then. So there was this big challenge then of things were much more fixed in place and calendarized. Whereas now I think there's more flexibility. People can log into programs, they can log into whatever platforms they've got, and they've got access to stuff. I think one of the big challenges of that is there's now a huge emphasis on content and knowledge, and not sufficient on actually skills and habit building. So companies have these enormous LMSs with, just tons and tons of information. A, people can't find their way around them. And then B, they participate. I have a LinkedIn learning course, and every day I get, comments, congratulations, you finished your LinkedIn learning course. And I always ask people, I always comment and I say, and what are you going to do with what you've learned? Because just doing that kind of course won't change what you do. And I think that's where we really need to start being having much more emphasis is thinking about what do we need people to do and how can we support them in the workplace to make those changes that they need to make.
Yeah, so that whole transition thing, and that's kind of where I went to that question second, because I was thinking, going back to us as enablers of learning in an organisation, we can't be the person to do it for others. A lot of this then comes down to who is going to mentor or support you through that. And not every business has is able to put people into mentor and coaching roles. So again, maybe it comes back to the line manager. And do the line managers have the time, skill, or inclination to coach their people in the area of learning? Or what have you learned and what you're going to do with that learning? That's a sort of thing that occurs to me as, I suppose, if I was in an HR role now, I mean, and then this is the case, everything comes down to the poor line manager, if we're honest. What can we do to see if people are learning and to talk to them about it? I mean, are there any other things that, great ideas that we could suggest to people as to how to encourage that reflection and encourage that transfer of that knowledge?
So I think for me, one of the things that we should be doing as L&D, or as businesses, as organizations, HR, wherever we are in that role, is actually helping people understand how learning works, because there are so many myths that abound out there, and people do still think, well, if I go on a course, then I'll come back and I'll be a new me. And there's plenty of people selling courses like that. So I think it's about enabling our people to actually understand how learning works and recognize that, what I need is so there's something around asking them the right questions. What I need is a skill, and in order to get a skill, I need to be able to do stuff. I need to practice. I need to experiment. And unfortunately, line managers really are still incredibly key, incredibly important, because they're the person who has the most influence over what do you do in your daily work. They observe you do your daily work usually. And they are the ones who, given coach sufficient, skills and time. I think that's the biggest challenge is the time.
Mm.
One of the things we're doing with our platform is supporting line managers to support learners, so that they're actually nudged and prompted, so that they're not having to think all the time, oh my goodness, has Lucinda done that course? I must ask her about it. I must check in with her. But actually they're prompted at kind of the right time, a relevant time to ask you a question. But they're also prompted with some of the coaching questions that would help. So I think, if you're a line manager who perhaps hasn't had a coaching skill or hasn't been trained on coaching, yeah, if you're given, like a checklist almost of, here's some good questions to ask Lucinda about that program she's working through, and don't wait until the end. Ask her now while she's excited about it and starting. Ask her some questions. Well, she maybe gets stuck a little bit, maybe here's some more things you can do. And as you see her start to implement those new behaviors and practices into the workplace, that's when you really need to start giving, feedback. We call it feed forward. Actually, we try and work more on feed forward than feedback. So I think line managers are always going to remain vital. But also, how can you use peers to support you? I think there's other people in the business. It doesn't need to be a line manager, but you do need somebody to kind of check in and you feel responsible for.
And it's that kind of enabling that active reflection, or to reflect with the help of someone. One of the things that occurs to me, and this is the challenge, is if we go back to the 20 years ago question, it was quite passive. We used to think about, people talk about sheep training, but people come and say, oh, why are you on a training course? Because I was sent. It was very much kind of seen as not their responsibility to learn. And now really people, this whole, you say you can take on the knowledge, but a lot of it comes down to how willing people are to take that on and see the value of it. And I suppose one of the things you said was helping to explain how learning works, or train people. How would you simply explain that to someone who to get that point across? Because I imagine that some of that is that you've got to take some responsibility for this, or you've got to reflect.
Absolutely. You as the learner. I mean, for me, learning is kind of, there's three people or three factors responsible. One is you, the learner. One is the design of the learning and possibly L&D's role. And then there's the role of the organization who supports you to actually implement their learning. So all those three kind of pieces are required. But as far as the learners, it is your responsibility, because it's your brain that's going to change. It doesn't matter how fantastic the training is, how supportive your manager is. If you don't have a need or a requirement, or you can't see the point, you will not put the effort into changing your brain and your body, your physical changes, to actually build new habits, do new things. So as a learner, you need to be responsible for that, but you need to kind of be aware that that's how it happens. And, I think in the past, we very much focused on sending people on courses and they'll come back, magically changed.
Yeah.
It's not magic, it's science.
Yes. Now that's great segue into neuroscience. And again, I'm thinking when I did psychology, they talked about Kolb's learning cycle. And I'm not even sure. I know certain things like learning styles are discredited and things now. Is that the case? I'm thinking shaking your head. Do you want to tell me a bit about what is seen as the right science there, and then how this links into, I guess, proven through your knowledge of neuroscience?
So there's huge amounts of science around learning, and the science of learning has always been there, and of course it keeps evolving all the time. So neuroscience is a part of that. That's how our brain actually learns. I actually think if everybody had some knowledge about how their brains learn, and actually people do have knowledge about how their brains learn, they have some intrinsic knowledge of how their brains learn. One of the questions I often ask people is, how did you learn to ride a bike? And, they can quite easily describe the process of learning to ride a bike, which takes time. You can't learn to ride a bike in 10 minutes. And they can quite easily describe that process. And actually, that process is pretty much the same for any skill we're learning. And even with knowledge, you still need that process of, taking time, practice, coming back to it again, recalling it. But somebody else can't learn to ride a bike for you. Yeah. Only you can learn to ride a bike. So using the science, using kind of practical examples like that to explore the science and see what's the science of that. And my experience has been that most people are really interested to learn about their brains. They're really interested to kind of think about, well, how do I function? How do I behave? So beginning to explain to them that, all learning starts with a need. We don't learn something unless we've got a need. So you need to feel motivated. We have a particular model. So I'll give you the model because I think it helps to have something to tag something onto. So the first thing is you have a need to want to be able to do something or to do something differently. So that's the kind of the transfer goal. What are you aiming for? You need to feel motivated throughout the learning journey or the learning process, because learning is quite hard work. You're going to make a lot of changes, physical changes in your brain that use a lot of energy. So you need to be motivated throughout. And learning, sometimes, you get stuck. If you're practicing, you can think, oh, I'm not getting anywhere, I'm getting things wrong. So you need to keep so motivation is really important, to maintaining motivation, which is why support.
Sometimes you get worse at things, don't you? Or find it really hard. You go through a bit of a dip in it. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. You can get worse, and then you can hit a plateau.
Yeah,
all those things. And then what you need is some kind of guidance or experience. So maybe it's some information or an experience of something, that's kind of at the right level for where you are. So one of the challenges in training is often that you get an expert teaching you who's already, 25 years maybe ahead of you, and they tell you everything they know, as opposed to, what do I need to know, or what do I need to be able to do to just do this job that I want to do?
Right
so
now.
Breaking it down into the right kind of level of guided information, guided support. And then you need an opportunity to experiment with that new experience, that new information. You need to be able to practice in a safe place. You need to kind of test it out. You need to ask it questions. You need to kind of build it into, what do I already know? What can I already do? So that it starts to make sense in your brain, basically. So there's that experiment piece, kind of hypothesizing, testing, practicing, getting feedback, but still in that safe environment. Then what you want is to start applying it in the real world. So this is where you're starting to shift from, whether it's formal or informal, you're actually starting to put it into practice in your real role. And that's where, a manager can be incredibly supportive, because they can see you do something, they can validate that you've done something. They can give you feedback and say, look, you did this piece of it really well, and in order to get better, this is what you need to keep on practicing. And you need to keep practicing over and over again until, you're beginning to build a habit. And then the final piece of our model is the retain piece, which again is more practice, but also almost every skill you learn has some kind of level of knowledge as well. So how do you retain the knowledge, the new knowledge you need, in order to be able to, practice or use the new skill? And that's where, all the evidence shows that spaced practice and spaced repetition are really important. So you don't want to cram information. You need to spread it across time.
For it being long-term, so I suppose long-term memory, and that kind of being able to use it for real. And I mean, that's where you can see that the sort of classic going on a course for a day to learn something isn't really going to work, because you get too much, and really what you want is a little bit and go and practice it, and then a little bit and then go and practice it.
Absolutely.
There was one course that I did years ago, I used to train on, and actually it was quite effective it was a presentation skills course, and it was a 2-day course. But what you did was it did literally get people up for 30 seconds, teach them a minuscule little bit of skill, which they then get up and practice that. And there were about 8 progressions, and you still would need to go off and progress it afterwards. But you were able to kind of go through that cycle a number of times on a course when you were together with somebody, as opposed to tell someone all the content and then expect them to know how to kind of go and practice it where and when, which is really tricky.
We all have that ability to when you're being told something, you recognize it, you feel confident. I know that. But actually, when we testing is a really important part of learning.
Yes.
Because when you test yourself, you think that thing that I thought I knew, either I knew the knowledge or I knew how to do, actually I really don't. Oh no, I realized I haven't captured it yet, so I need to go back and revisit it. So there's lots of revisiting, lots of testing, and the more you test, the better. And it's not a trainer. Sometimes you get trainers repeating information to you. You need to do the repeating. You need to recall, because that's the way our memories work.
And interesting, I think kids, so my son's doing A-levels and he's got this flashcards app, which seems quite, I think it just may tie into what you're saying about neuroscience, because it has to write the questions and then it sort of tests you whether you know the fact or not. And if you know it, then it tests you a month's time, or, if you don't know it, you get it in a week's time. So it's kind of doing that spaced repetition for you, which is effective.
Which is where tech is so useful. So our platform does exactly the same. It uses what's called the Lightner method, which is, a flashcard type activity, and you're tested 24 hours after you've learned something, 2 days, 4 days, and it just goes up until you've got it, and then you can say, okay, that is in their long-term memory now.
So that's knowledge, though. Again, so you're saying so that with the knowledge, how do you then layer on skills? So
skills is similar. Again, you need time to practice and to reflect on that practice and to refine the practice. Sleep is also, one of the reasons that this spaced repetition works is because when we sleep, our brain actively consolidates both knowledge and skills. So sleeping is really important for your brain to kind of take what it's kind of absorbed during the day and work with it, and then kind of fit it back into the right places and connect it with what you already, what you already know or can do. So that's why this spacing of practice and repetition is so important, because it's literally enabling your neurons to make strong connections.
So, and that is, I suppose, you're saying then this is your neuroscience piece in terms of this, that we have to revisit. How does this kind of, I'm not sure whether everything we've talked about was all neuroscience, but how does this fit into neuroscience speak, if you like, what we're talking about? Because this feels very sensible, common sense learning with a spaced learning, doing reflection. Is that really what neuroscience is, without us being blown away by the title, or is there something more sciencey that we should know?
I mean, the neuroscience is much more complex, because it's looking at it at a kind of, a biological level, a physiological level. What's the electrical connections that are going on? What are the chemical connections that are going on in individual neurons or networks of neurons in your brain? You don't necessarily need to know it at that level, but it's really useful to know that your brains are neuroplastic, so they can make changes. We can change. I think that's, a big change from even when I was first sort of studying psychology. It was kind of a bit believed that your brain couldn't change very much. I don't know how we ever thought we learned when we didn't think our brains changed, but anyway. So there's the fact that, neuroplasticity is important. But I think the other thing that's really important is that our brains are really energy hungry. And so learning is actually a demanding activity. It uses energy, therefore, you're going to feel tired after you've learned something. So if you kind of, at the end of the day, your brain feels kind of like, whoa, I've done a really, almost like, your body's done a workout, then actually that's probably been a good thing, so long as you sleep afterwards to help it recover and to help create these memories.
Yeah, mentally exhausted. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
So so basically that is based on neuroscience. We don't need to know the neurons of it, but your model is probably quite helpful for people, because in terms of making sure people have got the need or want. So I suppose they need to know why it's relevant, or why they need to do it. They need some support to keep them motivated, and perhaps particularly when it gets tough, there's something about making sure that they get the information when they need it. So some of these things where we talk about LXPs and things like that, if you can get that the right information at the right level at the right time. That's ideal in terms of that. And then they need to be able to put it into practice and use it, apply it in the real world. So practice in a safe environment if it's something, you know, that you need to, or just be able to put it into practice and then use it again in terms of long-term practice. So that's what we need people to understand how to learn in the environments that we're in. So we as L&D or HR professionals might want to help people understand the why. So whether it's for their career development or whether this is a key part of your job, this is what you need to do. Make sure they've got some support systems if we can in place as well, and then access in whatever way we can to the information people need at the right level and get those opportunities to practice and recognize it.
And you just done a really great example there of learning, because I've told you something and you've repeated it back in your own words and you're making sense of it for yourself. That's a really good example of the sort of the experimenting part of practicing.
Yes, and that's interesting for me. I know that I have to do something with it, or I have to talk about it. I have to, in some way, if I just hear stuff, I haven't really got it. So I had to write it down and then practice about it, and then I went, yeah, okay, I can get that. That's my first stage for me with something like that. I do think flashcards.
So that's what I mean when I say people do kind of know how they learn. It's just we don't always put it into practice. And I think particularly when it comes to formal learning, we kind of just expect that it's being done for us, though it's often being done to us rather than for us.
Yes.
We need to put that effort in ourselves.
Yes. And I suppose also as trainers or deliverers, one of the things all of us might be doing webinars and things like that. We can do something which is just a data dump, which people, even if they're not doing their emails in the background, or we can try and use technology to make sure that people feel they've got to actually work a little bit for it and vaguely process it.
I think that's the most important thing you can think about learning, that learning is work. It's enjoyable work because it, you know, you get something at the end of it, but it is work. And if you don't feel that you've struggled, you probably haven't learned anything. There's something called desirable difficulty. And, you know, if something is too easy, it probably isn't going to stick.
Yes. You won't even try to learn it. So that's our kind of neuroscience piece and talking about how people learn. And then if we're melding this with AI, which and again, I don't, maybe you've already given us an example of it in terms of how your system works. How does AI come into this?
So for me, the distinction is neuroscience is really good for making sure that the learning you do is effective, that by the end of it, you know, you will have learned to do something new. You'll have a new skill or a new habit. Where the AI comes in, it can help you be more efficient in that. So it can help L&D or HR be more efficient because it can really help you create content quickly, which is a big challenge because a lot of people are just stopping there. So they're using AI just to create content, but it can create content. Still needs to be validated by a human because AI isn't actually intelligent. So it can't tell that those two words that I'm not going to put together, one that ends in ing and one that ends in iles, I'm not going to put them together because if AI hears them, it'll connect them. So the AI can help by, you know, creating content. It can suggest behaviors. So you can ask AI, you know, what behaviors, if I wanted to have the skill of negotiation, what behaviors could I be expected to demonstrate as a you know, a skilled negotiator? So it can really help you kind of identify behaviors. And that's one of the things we specifically do in our platform, is to identify the behaviors, because behaviors are so much more important than content. It can personalize a journey for a learner. So it can look at, you know, what can this learner already do? What's already been validated, so that if the learner says, well, I can already, or can actually demonstrate that they can do a particular behavior, then they don't need to learn that part of the journey. So it can take them on, you know, a different route. So it can start to personalize much more effectively.
That's like your efficiency thing, I'm guessing, is that's big.
So that's definitely the efficiency.
Yeah,
you're not wasting time learning stuff you've already.
Yes, and then also you're going to be more motivated because it's more, you know, you're not being told stuff at the wrong level, I guess, too.
Absolutely. There's nothing worse than hearing something you already, well, not hearing something, but, you know, being taught something you can already do quite competently.
Yeah.
I have many stories on that. It can help you create other activities. So it can also support, you know, I think I said that, you know, our platform enables supporting managers. so that it can support relevant activities in the workplace. So the AI can suggest not just content, but based on that content, what would be a good activity for this person to do? What would be good spaced repetition questions for this person? And the AI can then obviously deliver those spaced repetition questions at a relevant time. So if we talk about kind of efficiency and effectiveness, when I was training 10 years ago, I used to always put spaced repetition questions into all my training. Well, I've always done it. But what I used to have to do was write all the spaced repetition questions myself, then put them all into emails that I then had to, kind of calendarize.
Yes.
And then they went out, which was, semi-automated. That was better than me having to write them an email every other day. But then I had no idea whether they were actually getting them, whether they were answering them. Whereas the AI now, if you've got it all programmed in, you can actually track. So are people answering the questions? Are they getting them right? You can actually measure. So AI is also really valuable for help. I mean, tech generally is helpful for helping you measure and track, but the AI can also help you sort of identify, where are people getting stuck? Are there places where they're getting stuck that they might need more support? The AI can then flag that and then call for help for whoever it might, or the AI can help itself, with bots and things. The AI can say, Lucinda, I think you seem a bit stuck, what would help you? And even sometimes just that reflection can help a learner.
I mean, so it is, you can see how that would be or is really useful in terms of us as learners being able to basically hold us accountable. So it's useful for the learner because they're going, oh, okay, if I don't reopen an email, no one really knows. There's no consequence. There's a consequence and it's visible that you have or haven't tried to answer it. But it's also useful. So that's useful for my accountability, but it's also useful for us as kind of creating the content as to how effective bits of it are if people get stuck on them. And I suppose overall as a business, it is a way of measuring it. You're getting more of a measure of progression in principle.
Yeah, you can see have people progress through a journey. Typically with old-fashioned face-to-face courses or online digital courses now, we tend to ask at the end, did you enjoy the training?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether you enjoy it or not. That's actually not a measure of learning at all. Was there a nice lunch? All those things. Was the trainer nice? All those things actually aren't measures of learning. But if you can actually track that people can recall the information they need and can do the activities that they're expected to do, and you can see that throughout the journey, you can see that progress. That makes it much more visible to everybody. And also we know that progress motivates people. So if you can see you're making progress, I couldn't do that last week, I can do this week. That's also adds to the motivation too.
Yes, it's interesting. I was going to what extent do you think you need to gamify? There's so much jargon, isn't there? I mean, my head keeps going to Duolingo, actually. My husband's really into it, but some of those, which I think, does a lot of these things, and you've got the games and you've got the league and you can't drop out of it. Or you're completely absent yourself from it because you get annoyed with it, which is my position. But what do you see your position in terms of there's this AI piece and there's gamification? How necessary is it? Because I suppose if we talk about how do we practically do this as professionals in an organization?
So I am not a strong believer in gamification. I think it works for some people. And I think, as with many things, giving people the choice. So I know I also do Duolingo. Giving people the choice to, match themselves against other people, to have badges and things. For some people, that really works. For some people, it's just a complete turn off and doesn't help them at all. So the gamification works for some and not others. So I think it's a case of having the option to use the gamification or not. I don't think good learning doesn't need gamification. Good gamification can sometimes help with learning.
And would it fit into more of the efficiency or the effectiveness bit, I'm wondering? Or maybe
it depends what you're doing with the games. It can fit into both, because if you're obviously getting people to play games where they're actively practicing the skill, that will help with effectiveness.
Yes.
And it's the automation. I think it's the automation rather than the gamification, the technology aspect.
Technology taking out
that the means that you haven't got to have somebody else doing it. The automation is helping.
So I suppose then sort of linking this back to the average person who may well be an HR department of one, so they haven't got time to to invest in it? A lot of this feels like you need to have the expertise possibly to create the learning content, or it's very expensive if you've got to buy the learning content, so you might not have resources. What practical things would you suggest to people, I suppose, in smaller, because we've got a lot of people who are in smaller businesses, and so it all sits on them. What top tips have you got if people want to try and introduce some of this in?
At the risk of selling myself and our business, have a look at our platform, because have a look at our platform, because it will help you to do all that. And you don't need to be an expert. You need to be able to validate what the AI generates, but you don't need to be an expert in doing it. And it also creates learning based on those principles I've just talked about. So you don't need to be an expert. It can do it for you. So one of our target audiences is kind of subject matter experts who have a slight tendency to tell you too much and not give you the practice stuff. It will help subject matter experts to build programs that are actually much more effective and efficient. But if you're not going to, access, or even if you are, I think using tech, look at what tech can support you, but always check, is that tech just helping you with efficiency? Because AI can help you be highly, highly efficient at producing rubbish. So you do need to think about, what's the effectiveness we're looking at? What are we actually trying to achieve? And is that tech helping us achieve it? So when you're looking at, one of the things I always say to our sort of people I kind of do learning audits and things for is, check with your tech supplier, what's their views on learning? And if they're just talking all about content, then you might want to say to them, but how do you go beyond the content to actually supporting learning in the workplace? Because that's what we're aiming for. We're looking at people to do their jobs, to be able to perform better, to be able to perform faster. I was just talking to a client earlier on, they need people onboarded really, really quickly. How can we support that? And I think also recognize that learning just isn't magic. You can't onboard people faster than their brains can actually process stuff. Our brains are almost the slowing factor.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, probably a different topic for another day, but a lot of people that we work with would have, we've got XYZ large supplier of a catalogue of 40 or 50 courses, but it would, in terms of what they would probably be doing is monitoring completion of it. And so you would want to see, is there ongoing testing? Is there stuff beyond this that this platform or provider can offer, which going back to say it's spaced learning, or, is there a report to the manager, or is there something we can do that's actually giving us greater impact of the effectiveness of this content?
Yeah. And I think getting those managers involved, right at the start, to ask the manager, what do you want this person to do? How are you going to support this person to achieve their aims? Because just doing an e-learning course, or whether it's linked, whatever it is on these platforms, that's not going to help them achieve. It's not going to help them achieve what you want them to be able to do. And also, if they spend the time on this training that's going to be ineffective, they've also wasted their time. And the time that you could have had them actually practicing something. That's why I think things like apprenticeships are so good, because you're learning on the job.
Yeah, for real. Absolutely. As long as you get the right support, of course.
Of course, yes. It comes back to that all the time. I think it's that, I said earlier on, it's that kind of trilogy between, the learner, the support they're getting from, managers, organization, L&D, whoever it may be, and the design of the learning itself. Or even if it's informal, it's not designed, then you as a learner have to be more conscious about, what are you making your own design effectively? How are you going through that learning journey?
I think it's one of those things it's very thought-provoking is what I would suggest. I think if you look about how things have always been done in organizations, my message to people listening to this would be, are we actually getting value from it? Because quite often there's huge amounts of money being spent on really traditional things, but it's not actually doing anything. And is it time for a rethink? Is it time for some fresh thinking? And I think certainly that's where, I guess, Stella, just obviously we'll put your details in the show notes, but if they follow Stella on LinkedIn, read some of the stuff that you put out. But if people want to contact you, Stella, to find out more about what it is you offer, that certainly it's another way of doing things. It's a different way of looking at traditional learning, isn't it? And more evidence-based.
Absolutely. And I think, what's really important is that there's lots of things in traditional learning that are effective and useful, coming together socially, learning from other people. That's really good, but it's just not enough.
Yes.
It needs to be, you need to have all the elements in place in order to have effective learning. I think, keep going back to that. How did I learn to ride a bike?
Yeah.
It's the process.
Yes.
Yeah.
Completely. Wonderful. Stella, do you want to just share your website details for people who are listening and wondering right now? And obviously we'll put them in the show notes, but if you want to just...
Yeah. So it's www.stellar.labs, STELLAR labs.io.
Brilliant. And you're available on LinkedIn.
So you can find me on LinkedIn. Yes.
And lots of other places. Brilliant. Yeah. Thank you so much. I found that a really very interesting conversation, really thought-provoking one for early in 2024. So hopefully lots of people can think about how they can do more about people's development and learning in their organisation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucinda.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.